So I'm going to start recording now. Welcome everyone to today's session in which we will explore what it's like to navigate our unique identities in different cultural contexts. So I just want to say that if we experience any technical difficulties, I apologize. I feel like technology is a lifelong learning tool, and sometimes we get it right and sometimes we don't. So please bear with me. But I really just want to start by introducing myself. So my name is Ashley Bayman. I am a global learning coordinator and advisor at UC Santa Cruz, and I use she, her, aya pronouns. As a undergraduate student, I was a female of color. I was low income, first generation. I used financial aid throughout college to support my collegiate pursuits. I transferred from a community college and I worked 2 jobs throughout college. So when I was in college, I studied abroad 3 times, once in Mexico during community college, and then in Brazil and Argentina when I got to the university. And I can tell you that each of my experiences studying abroad were profoundly different, and many of the challenges I experienced were in direct relation to my identities. For example, when I was in Brazil, I was the only Black student in my cohort, so I felt very minoritized in that space of students. But because Brazil is a mixed heritage nation, I was actually part of the majority of the population for the first time ever in my life. But as an American, I was still excluded. Contrastingly, when I was in Argentina, I felt more minoritized than ever because it is a very white nation. And that was at first very, very difficult to adjust to. I felt that, in Argentina, I always got looks on the train and out in public because Black people are so underrepresented there. So I say all this to say that it can be really helpful to, think about who you are and what your values are, because oftentimes how you identify may be perceived very differently in another culture. So just so you all have an idea of what we'll actually be covering today, we are going to start looking at, how our unique intersectional identities can impact our experience on a global learning program. And then we will consider how new cultural contexts can not only change the way we see ourselves, but also how others might perceive us. And then finally, we will look at some resources that you all can use to set realistic expectations for yourself, which will also contribute to your overall program experience. So to get started, can anyone unmute yourself or put in the chat what you think is significant about an iceberg, and not just the Titanic reference, although this is a classic song. Anyone have any ideas? You might have been asked this before. Please feel free to put it in the chat or just unmute yourself and share with us. Why do we always talk about an iceberg when we refer to culture? Absolutely. Thank you, Jareth. So there's more underneath than you can see. That's right. You really only see a tiny part of it on the surface. It's mostly beneath the surface. And had the crew of Titanic realized this, we may not know the infamous saying, "I'll never let go, Jack." But, that's neither here nor there. So looking at how that relates to culture, it's actually a really great metaphor because, when we think about culture, usually surface level things come to mind, right? So for example, if I ask you, what are the first things you think about Italy? You might say pizza, pasta, wine, right? If I ask you about Brazil, you might immediately think of the International Festival Carnival. Or if I ask about Japan, you may think about the clothing like, the kimono. These are all aspects of culture that we can easily identify or see. But there are many things under the surface or the deep level of culture that aren't easily identifiable. So, examples could be a culture's view on authority, courtesy, or even time. For example, perhaps your notion of courtesy and the host culture's notion of courtesy is different. And that's why you might get upset that people don't say, "excuse me," when they bump right into you in public, or, they're elbowing you to get ahead of you at the grocery store checkout. Or maybe your concept of time is different than theirs. So that's why you're upset that everyone is late to your party or social gathering. I can say that when I studied abroad in Brazil, I came to learn very quickly that punctuality wasn't really a thing there. So if you're invited to a party at 8, you would be early if you got there by 10. So coming from my own cultural background, I had to quickly realize that this was not something, to get mad about, but rather understand and adapt to. And these deep level aspects of culture are often areas in which we might notice friction or tension between our own cultural norms and values. So now we're going to take a look at self-culture and how our identities may shift in different cultural contexts. So looking at my own cultural iceberg, as part of my visible identities, you might be able to tell that I'm BIPOC, although it might not be immediately apparent what my race or ethnicity is. You may also see that I'm female, able-bodied, and while I'm no spring chicken, I also hope I don't look over 50 either, which would place me in the millennial generation off of looks alone, and you'd be right. However, invisibly, sorry, just admitting people, invisibly, you may not be able to tell that I am actually, multiracial coming from a mixed race household. Unless you know me, you might not infer that I am cisgender, meaning, that my gender corresponds with my birth sex. Other aspects you might not immediately guess is that I am low income. I was a first generation and transfer college student, and those lived experiences of mine in higher ed led me to be an equity-minded practitioner. So, as I mentioned, in different cultural spaces, we may experience a shift in our own cultural icebergs. One shift could be a shift in privilege. When I studied abroad as a low-income first-generation transfer student of color, I didn't consider myself privileged at all. I worked my butt off with 2 jobs as a waitress and bartender just to be able to afford to study abroad, and I still had to take out loans that I am paying for to this day. So please apply for scholarships if you are considering studying abroad or away. But what I found is that economic privilege changes drastically in other cultural environments. So while I identified as a low-income student in places like Mexico and Brazil, I would technically be considered middle class because of the average salaries in those countries and my access to the American dollar, which is a stronger form of currency in Latin America. Another privilege that we may not always think about is being able to, just access higher education, whether it's community college or a university. For example, in some countries, there still exists gender inequality in higher ed. I've also included a quote here from one of our students about what it was like to realize her own privileges. She said, I think coming to terms and accepting the fact that I do have privilege for being born in the US, I knew that I had privilege, but Costa Rica really made me think about it a lot more, especially having kids say, I want to go to the US, or how's Disneyland? Have you ever seen that? Then realizing, whoa, these kids might never have the opportunity to do that when I live 20 minutes away from there. Or these kids might not have the opportunity to go to school or go to university because they're so behind in their studies, or because, a lot of parents don't really feel it's necessary, or they work. Another shift example may be identifying first as an American when you don't necessarily see that as being one of your main identity markers. Some of us have complicated feelings about our relationship to the US. So abroad, it might be difficult and confusing identifying and confronting your Americanness. An example from a student is as follows. She said, ultimately, I was not quite at home in Latin America either. My Spanish had a bit of an American accent, and my independence was foreign to many women I met. Older women were shocked to hear about my 2 years living and working in San Francisco. You lived in an apartment on your own, so far from your family? Locals began calling me gringuita, claiming I had become too Americanized. And even though we shared a heritage, many people I met in the region didn't seem to understand what it was like to be in the minority. When I told my family members about my political views or my previous job as a teacher helping immigrant and Latino students gain access to education, it was difficult for them to understand how Latinos in the United States were at such a statistical disadvantage. They didn't have to defend their culture or work for its equality. Meanwhile, I could only understand my culture through its position in the United States. My second generation identity could not exist anywhere but there. That made me feel more American than anything else. Now, on the flip side of this, Others might think that, you don't look American because there are assumptions that all Americans are white. Many times these assumptions aren't based, they're based on ignorance rather than prejudice. So I want to show a quick video at what another student had to say about his experience in England.
My last thing is that being being a Black American in England, I think, or maybe just in Europe, but specifically here, because a lot of people ask me more here than anywhere else, is like, are you really American? Like, what do you think American looks like? Like, they have this concept that Americans are like white. That's problematic. Like, they ask me, like, I'm like, oh, American. They're like, oh, but what really are you? It's like, someone in America said that, that would be so racist. Next question is like, are your parents American? It's like, yes. Oh, are their parents American? Yes. They were all freaking born here. Unless you go back 200 years ago, then they weren't. So like, oh, well, you look Caribbean, or you look like you're from Somalia or like South Africa. And I'm like, yes, well, I'm pretty sure somewhere down the line, my history does go back there. But just because my skin color is that way now does not mean I'm not American. I was born in America. I'm full-fledged American. Like, oh, like how'd you get to America? Like, why are you over there? It's like, what do you think America's comprised of? Like, it does not make any sense.
Yeah, and I actually can relate to that because a lot of the times when I was in Latin America, they'd ask where I'm from, and I'm like, oh, I'm from the US. And they're like, but your padres? And I'm like, well, my padres are also from the US, like it goes back a while. So either having to confront your own Americanness or being denied your Americanness can be really kind of shocking at times.
My last thing is,
okay, so now I really want to share my own cultural icebergs and how they change and even sometimes clash when I studied abroad. So I shared earlier what I perceive as some of my most salient identities when I'm in the US. But what I found was that in different cultural environments, other parts of my identities came to the surface that I don't even think about. For example, in Latin America, it's still obvious that I'm a woman of color, which is why I was always referred to as morena. But folks in my cultural communities very much saw me as an American and as a foreigner outsider. While I spoke Spanish and Portuguese, I was still learning at that time. So it was obvious that I'm an English speaker, Anglophone. And again, because of my access to a strong form of currency, I was not seen as someone from a low income background, but rather someone from a middle socioeconomic status because I was studying abroad as part of my college experience. Again, these are parts of my identity that I never think about in the US, but they also kind of defined how others perceive me in Latin America. In terms of my invisible identities, my US values really came to the surface in various ways, starting with my comfort with personal space. If you go to Latin America, you'll find that a lot of times in public transport or while standing in a line, personal space isn't really a thing. I guess I have a direct form of communication in the sense that if I have a thought, I'll express it. And in Argentina, for example, my experience with classroom pedagogy was more or less authoritarian. So like, the professor is the holder of knowledge and the students are there to learn rather than question. Some other US values I noticed more were my timeliness and punctuality. And also in the US, I'm used to, waiting in line to purchase items. But at the street food stalls in Argentina, if you're not aggressive, then you're not getting your choripan. So again, really the point of this presentation is to get you all to recognize how your perception of your identity might change in your host culture and to prepare yourself for those transitions. Like it's nothing negative, but it is important to think critically about all parts of your identity and how some parts may come to the surface in unexpected ways during your global learning program. So now that we've kind of talked about how the many varied aspects of our identity can impact our experience, I want to shift to identifying resources to help us navigate these changes. So the first most important thing I want to stress is how important it is to research your host culture to understand their climate towards different identities. Being knowledgeable about issues of discrimination, equality, and racism in the host culture can really help prepare you for how the culture may react to one or more parts of your identity. For example, when I went to Argentina, I think I had this very romanticized view of what Argentine society was like. I pictured like tango on the streets and fresh meats everywhere and just an overly idealized view of the culture. But when I got there, I was literally shocked by the lack of POC in the country and oftentimes felt isolated because, I was kind of the only one of my identity in many different spaces. I feel like if I had done my research, I could have better prepared myself for this, or even tried to like establish relationships with other students of color going on my program. Another example is that in Latin America, they use the term negro as sometimes a form of endearment, but as a Black person from the US, Negro means something entirely different. So it's really important to prepare ourselves for these different cultural climates. It's also super important to, build a support system while you're in your host culture, whether that's with other peers who identify similarly to you so that you can share your feelings and experiences, or you could even, look online at social media for different supportive communities in the culture you'll be going to. You should also stay in touch with friends and family back home so that you can go to them to process your experiences. I can say that many of your campus study abroad offices are also able to connect you with alumni who participated in your program. For example, here at UC Santa Cruz, we have a form that students can fill out if they would like to be connected with someone who not only participated in their program, but also shares one or more parts of their identity. So please be sure to contact your study abroad office to see how you can connect with former participants who studied in your program, just to learn about what the program and the culture is like from a student's perspective. And then finally, it is so crucial that you just have an open and curious mind during your time abroad or away. I think the key to a successful experience is being flexible and adaptable to the many changes you experience. Having this adaptable mindset really allows you to kind of embrace challenges as learning opportunities. For example, I remember when I was in Argentina, I was really shocked by the time in which they ate dinner. And I think this is true throughout Europe as well. So coming from the US, I always thought that you should eat dinner at like 7:30 to give food time to digest. So you're not going to sleep, on a full stomach. But in Argentina, we ate dinner with my host family at like 9:30, 10. So if I had lunch at 1, I'm waiting a full 8 hours until I have, a meal. And at first I thought this was like wrong and just contrary to how I grew up. But by the end of my experience, I actually valued our late dinners. And afterwards, we'd have the sobremesa, in which we'd have a little bit of coffee. We'd talk to each other about our days, and then we'd end up watching telenovelas. So just know that things might be different, but that these differences can be enjoyed and celebrated too. Okay, so finally, I want to share QR codes with you for different campuses that have identity resources posted on their website. You can take a picture at any of these QR codes and be connected to a campus's identity resources. And this is not inclusive of all campuses, but is definitely a good place to arm yourself with information and just to better prepare yourself for your global learning journey. I know it's a quick presentation, but I want to be mindful of everyone's time. I do want to end with this quote that is, "The beauty of the world lies in the diversity of its people." So I really appreciate you all for being here. I know I talked maybe fast, but hopefully you kind of got the gist of today's presentation. And right now, I really want to open the floor up to any questions that you guys might have. Please feel free to put them in the chat or unmute yourself. I'm here to serve as a resource to you. So thank you all. And I'll also put my email in the chat in case you want to connect with me directly. If any questions come to mind about things that were presented today, please feel free to write me. So we do have a question. How should we react in a host country if we experience an ignorant encounter during our program? Well, like I mentioned, depending on the context of that encounter, obviously, it could be, that there's some prejudice behind it, or it could just be that they're ignorant to your own cultural norms and values. So I think that's a really great learning opportunity, not only for you, but the person who's being ignorant in that situation. So I would say, maybe don't get defensive right off the bat. and it obviously will depend on the context. But, don't get defensive and just educate them on why, what they said might have offended you or why you perceived it as ignorant. I think, it's really important, especially in the world that we live in now, to kind of have these constructive conversations with each other. Obviously, things like discrimination and racism are very cultural, right? And it depends. While in the US, racism is heavily based off of, race and ethnicity. In some places, it might be based on religion or political views or things like that. So I think, using that experience as an educational moment can be really helpful for whoever, is doing something offensive. Great question, Christopher. Thank you. Anyone else have any other questions for me? I have another one. How long did it take you to figure out that people arrived to get together later than the said time? And how did you react to it the first few times? As a Hispanic, I'm curious since it's considered common knowledge in my culture. Yeah, absolutely. So I think I experienced this the most in Brazil. I remember, I was invited to a Brazil gathering and man, they party all night long. But the example I used, they said to get there at 8. And so I was there at 8 just because from my own cultural background, like I was ingrained that being timely is super important. And then when I'm there and then I'm helping to set up the party with everyone, when I'm like, oh, I thought it was already supposed to be started, I was just a little surprised. But I actually really appreciated that because like I feel like it allows more bonding too, because you're now helping get things together and you're having more intimate conversations than you might have if you came and everyone was already there. So all I can say is that I learned really quickly. I mean, I think the first time when I was like, where's everyone at? They're like, oh, girl, let us learn you real quick. And I learned real quick. And so, later on, I might even like suggest, can I help you guys set up? Or another thing, again, I'm maybe a little bit older now, but I'm not used to like going out super, super late. In Argentina, their clubs are called boliches. And sometimes the club wouldn't open till like 2 a.m. And I'm like, I'm expected to stay up till 2, and that's usually when I'd be coming home and going to bed. So learning to take like siestas and cat naps during the day were really helpful during that time. But yeah, I think you learn quick when you make mistakes. You're like, okay, note to self, don't do that again. Ooh, what if we find love abroad? I will admit, in Mexico, okay, I studied abroad 3 times. I think 2 of those 3 times I had amorous encounters and I ended up dating the person that I met on my study abroad programs. And I think that's also another really great way to get to know the culture a little bit better because you're kind of more immersed in it, right? If you meet like a local, now you're having to speak the language a lot more than you would have maybe if you were just hanging out with friends from the US, or you're meeting their family and going to family gatherings. I think it's a really great cultural experience. So, c'est la vie, to each his own. And maybe 2 a.m. is too early to go home. You're right, but I'm a little older now. And back then, again, I said I bartended for a long time. So I was used to like closing the bar late. But because I was like not bartending, it was my first time not working ever when I was on my study abroad programs. I started working when I was 14 and a half. I got a work permit and I've worked every day since. So I think I was really just taking advantage of the fact that I didn't have to work and I could go to bed at a decent time rather than, the usual late nights that I was used to having at work. This is a really fun conversation. Thank you guys. Any other questions that are still lingering? Oh, finding love abroad. Would you say that it's a good idea to do it at all? I think that depends on your situation. Um, Again, I think there's a lot to be learned when you do meet someone, and you gain a close connection with them. I just appreciated the opportunities to experience the culture in a way that I wouldn't have been able to experience it, maybe had I not, found a partner while I was there. So I appreciated those opportunities. I think obviously you definitely want to stay away from any situation that's not allowing you to grow personally. Definitely stay away from any toxic relationships and just be safe about it. But obviously there can be both advantages and disadvantages to meeting someone while you're abroad. Thank you all so much. It's been really fun speaking with you all, even though we're not doing it face to face. But I will send you all a copy of this presentation. You have my information in the chat. So if you ever want to reach out, talk, I'm always here to provide any insight that I might be able to. So I'm going to stop the recording now.